Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is Seth Martin, your host. This is episode 634. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here and always happy you're listening. This is going to be the second time around to record this episode. I recorded it the other day and there was something wrong with the audio and I couldn't use it. So I'm going to try it again. It's an opportunity to improve the show, I suppose, although I don't really have time to do it again. A few days ago now, we talked about the invasion or the capture of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela. And I more or less said that I didn't like what was going on there. I didn't like that we were doing things like that, and wasn't really sure what it was all about. I had a hard time believing that it had anything to do with narco-terrorism, but some information has come out since then, and I wanted to share some of that with you guys because this could be a proper predicate for doing what we did, and I want to be fair. In general, I think we should just mind our business and trade with people and promote liberty here by our actions. That's really what I think we should do. I mean, you could always argue that that's just not possible, Seth, not in the world we live in. And maybe you're right. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem like we've tried it my way, but it's possible that that's just not the case. We can't just have a free society without government or something. I don't believe that, but it's possible. I have to consider that's a non-zero probability. But like I said, some additional information came out. It looks like Venezuela has things to do with maybe drug addiction, maybe trafficking, maybe voting, some of the voter fraud that we've been experiencing and that we've been witnessing around the globe all stems from Venezuela. And if this is the case, then yeah, I don't see how we can have, especially the voting part, I don't see how we can be told, hey, go out and vote, engage in the system, make your voice heard, this kind of stuff. And then just have politicians and the CIA and other intelligence agencies just decide who is going to be the most compliant leaders, and they decide to get who they're going to put in office. I don't think that's not a good way to run a country, okay? Especially one that's telling you, hey, you can go make a difference, engage in the system, vote. So, for a long time I've said voting doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. You don't get what you vote for. These are things that I've said in the past. And I still believe that to be the case, even if we didn't have a fraudulent voting system. But this potentially fraudulent voting system has a lot of implications. And so I just wanted to show the other side of the coin. I showed the other day when we talked about this, we talked about it from a non-interventionist standpoint. And I still think that's the best way. In the absence of states, I think that's what would happen is human beings would cooperate with one another, and to the extent that one of them wanted to initiate violence on another, you would have your right to defend yourself and return that aggression, but that's just not what we have. So, but there's a couple of some interesting clips that I want to share with you guys. And actually, I don't want to start on this one. I want to start with the Maria Machado lady. This is the lady that won the Nobel Peace Prize and ran the opposition in Venezuela, and very savvy, I think, political actor, pretty smart lady. But she kind of addresses this, people talk about we can't invade Venezuela, and she kind of makes the case that Venezuela's already been invaded, and that's an interesting case, and it's hard for me to dispute that case. But let's just listen to what she says, and then we'll come back and comment on it.
Some people talk about invasion in Venezuela, the threat of an invasion in Venezuela, and I answered, Venezuela has been already invaded. We have the Russian agents. We have the Iranian agents. We have terrorist groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, operating freely in accordance with the regime. We have the Colombian guerrilla the drug cartels that have taken over 60% of our populations, and not only involved in drug trafficking, but in human trafficking, in networks of prostitution. So this has turned Venezuela into the criminal hub of the Americas. And what sustained the regime is a very powerful and funded, strongly funded repression system. Where does that funds come from? Well, from drug trafficking, from the black market of oil, from arms trafficking, for human trafficking. We need to cut those flows. And once it happens and repression is weakened, it's over, because that's the only thing the regime has left, violence and terror. So we ask the international community to cut those sources, because the other regimes that support Maduro and the criminal structure are very active and had turned Venezuela into the safe haven for their operations into the rest of Latin America.
Okay. Now, I don't disagree with her. I mean, this is interesting. I mean, we kind of, let me just say that I didn't really know, actually, that Venezuela, in order to fund itself, in order to fund the government. Okay, so let's back up just a second. The government, if the government's going to exert force, a repression type force on its population, it needs money, right? It needs to pay the police. It needs to pay the army. It needs to pay all the political actors to spread propaganda and all that. Well, where does it get the money? Traditionally in Venezuela, they've gotten it from oil. But what's happened with the oil business in Venezuela since Chavez nationalized it all those years ago, back in 2005 or whatever it was, 2003, is it's just gone down. Just, they're not, production just goes down and down and down and down. And the reason production goes down and down and down and down is because the people that Chavez put in charge of it to run it don't know what they're doing. You actually have to have knowledge and skills to run something like an oil business. You know, the vertical integration of the oil business, that comes from extracting it from the ground, producing it, putting it in a pipeline, getting it to a refinery, refining it, distributing it. All these things, you have to have knowledge in order to do these things. And so essentially, he got rid of all those people and put his cronies in charge. So then the question is, well, where do we get the money? Okay. And what she's suggesting is that Maduro has been getting the money from drug trafficking, from human trafficking. We're going to learn here in a minute from voting, basically weaponizing voting around the world, the quote unquote democratic world. And this is how he's been getting his money. And what she's basically saying is, hey, you know, we've been asking the international community to drive a wedge into that, to cut those spokes that feed this repression regime at the center of the Venezuelan government. And it appears to me that was the predicate for Trump sending in this elite force to capture Maduro and his wife. I think that's just prima facie true. All right, I got several clips, and I want to play all of them because there's some interesting takes in each of them. This next one is with a guy named Jeremy, and Jeremy has a channel.
China sent it.
And he talks about political events just like we do on this show. I think what I try to do that's unique than what a lot of people do, and I use a lot of people's shows to try to make my point, but what I try to do is I try to connect a better way, and the better way in my mind is liberty. Okay, it's free people cooperating. Just think, if you have a job, just think about the way your job is and how you interact with people at work and how you interact with your customers and your vendors. This is all voluntary. Okay, there's nobody with a gun pointing it at anybody saying, you must do business with this guy, or this guy must do business with you, or these coworkers of yours must do this or that for you, right? People get paid. They're there because they want to be. They're there because they value the money more than they value sitting at home and watching TV or something. And so this is how human beings should interact in my mind. The state creates a dynamic where it makes it difficult for human beings to behave this way. And this is kind of the nature of the state. The nature of the state is force. The nature of the state is compulsion. And this interferes with the way human beings are normally designed to interact with one another. This is why soldiers come back from Afghanistan and they have PTSD, okay? Human beings are not used to running around killing other human beings. I mean, you have to have like pathological issues in order to do that forever or throughout a whole career. And so these guys come back and they've killed people, and it interferes with your soul. Okay? But that same thing, maybe let's call it a little bit softer tyranny. I mean, the maximum amount of tyranny is you picking up a gun and killing another human being, right? The government kind of operates from that extreme to maybe a soft tyranny extreme, where they create a bunch of rules, and if you violate the rules, you go to jail, you get fined. These are incentives not to violate the rules, right? And so this is kind of a softer tyranny. But then the government's fully capable from full-blown tyranny, which means killing other human beings and doing things like that. And so I use these clips from other people. They're not necessarily coming at things from a liberty perspective or a radical freedom perspective, but they have interesting things to contribute, and I like to use their media to demonstrate some of these things that they can contribute. And this guy Jeremy he's got a couple of interesting points that he makes, and so I want to continue and play some of those here now.
Later, America put him in handcuffs, an overnight success that took 5 years to build. Let me show you how. In 2020, America called Maduro a drug lord, not a president, a criminal. They said he used cocaine like a weapon to hurt Americans on purpose. They put a price on his head, $15 million, then $25 million, then $50 million. They didn't use tax money. They used his own stolen cash. The trap was set. They just needed the right moment. 2024, Venezuela votes. Maduro tries to cheat again. Same trick he always uses. But this time the people were ready. 600,000 volunteers, regular people. They took photos of every vote count slip. They got 83% of them. The math was clear. Maduro lost big time. The other guy got 67%. Maduro got 30%. When Maduro said he won, the world saw the lie. The woman who led the fight won the Nobel Peace Prize. She became too famous to kill. Russia had big weapons in Venezuela, missiles, bombers. On the night America came, those weapons stayed quiet. Why? Russia is stuck in Ukraine. They can't fight two wars. And Maduro owned them billions. He couldn't pay. A new leader who might pay, that works for Russia. So they yelled about it, but did nothing. China, same story. They gave him 60 billion, and he stopped paying them back. When America blocked his oil ships, China went quiet. No ships, no loans, no help. They figured maybe a new guy will help pay us back. January 3rd, 2026. China sends a big team to meet Maduro. Xi's personal guy. They talk about friendship, partnership, brotherhood. Maduro says thank you. 3 hours later, the lights go out. American helicopters over the city, explosions everywhere. Maduro is grabbed, put on a plane, gone. The Chinese team is still there. They watched the whole thing. China sent a handshake. America sent helicopters. Maduro thought oil would protect him forever. He thought Russia would save him. China would save him. But Russia was busy. China wanted their money back. And 600,000 Venezuelans took pictures of his lies. America didn't overthrow a president. They grabbed a drug lord who stole a country. His friends talked. America acted. The difference could not be more clear.
Okay. The first thing I want to talk about is this Maria Machado and this taking all these photographs, 600,000 pictures of these vote count slips to prove that Maduro wasn't president. That is genius. That is a very smart, politically savvy thing to do. And so when you look at that and they showed that Maduro wasn't the legitimate president of Venezuela, well, now you back up and you look at what Trump did. Well, maybe he didn't capture the head of state of another country. Maybe this guy was an interloper. So that's the first thing I want to point out. The second thing is, this guy's obviously coming to it from a pro-America, pro-military, we're the most awesome country in the world and all this other stuff. And I mean, that's kind of where I think he's coming from. But the interesting thing buried in there that he said that I just thought was eye-opening and I didn't realize this, is that China had a delegation in Venezuela at the time that this military operation took place. And I mean, can you imagine? You're there in a delegation. You met earlier that day or the day before, and you're in your hotel or whatever. The lights go out. You hear choppers. You don't even know what's going on, and you find out that Maduro has been nabbed and taken back to the United States along with his wife. And I mean, I just think that's an unbelievable juxtaposition there. So clearly, I mean, I don't think there's any dispute that China and Russia and Iran were involved with Venezuela, because we had kind of alienated Venezuela, which happens, right? If you impose sanctions on somebody, you alienate them in some way. I mean, they still need to trade. They need to be able to survive in the world. So they're going to go look for actors that will trade with them. And that's what they did. That's what Venezuela did. This is why sanctions, I think, are a bad idea. Unless somebody's just really, and maybe you could, they're really a pariah. Maybe you can argue that Maduro really was, but I don't know. I just don't think sanctions are the right way to go. I think a better way to go would be, yeah, we'll trade with you. You need to trade something of value, though, because we're not gonna let you pay in Bolivar or something like that, which is, oddly enough, is the same problem it seems like Russia and China had, is they had loaned money and couldn't get their money back because the guy had driven oil production down so low that he wasn't able to sell it at a high enough value on the market, the black market, to get enough money to pay off his debts. And so maybe that's why they're more or less quiet. I mean, they kind of squawked about it, I think, but essentially nobody's squawking too loudly about Maduro getting nabbed in the middle of the night. So, but again, nobody can just have one thing that they trade. For years, I think, especially as oil went to like $130, $135 a barrel, Venezuela did very well having primarily only oil. But then once oil got nationalized and a bunch of people, running it don't know what they're doing, when it goes down to 65 and your production goes down by 80%, there's just no money there anymore. And so that's kind of the problem you run into. This is why you need to put people in charge, or let the free market select people that are in charge that know what they're doing and can get the most for these resources. But Maduro didn't want to do that. Chavez didn't want to do that. Neither one of them. Okay. All right. This next clip is of Benny Johnson. Benny Johnson's also an interesting guy online, does a lot of interesting reporting. And so I want to play this clip from him. Now, he introduces the whole idea about this voting stuff, Dominion, Smartmatic, these companies. And I had heard about these companies before, especially Dominion, but did not know the history and had no idea that it was Venezuelan history. So this is very interesting. I want to listen to him talk about this.
Military signals doomsday for the globalist left. I just got off a phone call with a longtime friend of mine who, let's just say, is in clandestine diplomatic circles. And they laid it out clearly for me exactly what's at stake right now and why so many people are panicking about this arrest and the United States' actions against the narco-terrorist state of Venezuela. Venezuela doesn't really exist. Venezuela is a proxy for China, Iran, and Russia. And they use that proxy, which is not too far off the American coast, to wage statecraft level terrorism against the United States. And that comes in the form of chemical warfare, like with fentanyl, and in biological warfare, like with human beings, millions of them flooding across our borders, gangs, and other operations that they've run. Remember, Laken Riley was killed by a Venezuelan gang member, along with many other Americans. Millions of Americans have been killed by the chemicals inside of the drugs that Venezuela ships into our country. And so the end of that proxy battle, magnificently and stunningly through the evening, shuts down the capacity for our enemies to wage war against us in our hemisphere using that nation state. But it gets so much better. Listen to this.
Yeah. Now this part that he's talking about is the part I don't really care about. Okay. The drug trafficking. The way I look at drug trafficking, now human trafficking, That's different, but it's kind of the same. You know, these are signs that our society is unhealthy. The fact that people are willing to, take great risk of life and property and things like that to get drugs to a market like the United States, I think that says more about the people of the United States, and, why do we need to, there's kind of a circular thing here, if people, and there's all kinds of reasons people do drugs, and this is not the point of the show, but it seems like there's a circular thing happening here. The government takes money from us. It creates all these programs that create dependency and take people's desire to pursue life, in a way that's meaningful to them. It takes that away from them. Then they get stuck on drugs. Then they become homeless. And then the government takes more money to fight that problem. It just seems like, if you took a whole lot less money from us and let people freely trade without a bunch of restrictions, that we could do better than what we're doing, right? It just seems like every time the government tries to help, it creates, 5 more problems. And I think the drug problem, I think the human trafficking problem, I think these are all related. I mean, the reason there's people to traffic is because we've destroyed these countries overseas, and there's mass numbers of people moving from their homes. They're leaving the once safety of their home, and they're migrating somewhere. Well, it's easy, once people are away from their home, they're easily scooped up and got into the system, and people take advantage of that. I mean, it just seems like, well, just don't have wars, and then you don't have these mass migrations and these opportunities to traffic all these people. I mean, these problems are self-imposed. We created these problems, and now we're telling the world that we need to nab Maduro from Venezuela to fix the problems. And it just seems like if we weren't engaged in some of this stuff, some of these things wouldn't be happening. But now this next one, I think, is entirely different. I don't see any causality that would cause, the government or people inside the government to engage in voting fraud on the scale that this guy's about to tell us about. And so, especially in a society where, the Democrats especially run around and talk about how important voting is and how sacred voting is. And what we're finding out is, yeah, that's just a lie, because they don't really care how you vote anyway. They're just going to go change the votes. And they have the technology to do it. They've co-opted these companies like Dominion and Smartmatic and Sequoia, and can control your vote, just null out your vote and put in a vote for the candidate they actually do want. So let's play a little bit of this. This was, I thought, very interesting.
The individual who I spoke with, who has, let's just say, impeccable credentials on these things, has had dinner with Nicolas Maduro. This is an individual who's personally spoken with Nicolas Maduro and had conversations with him and his team. This is just what happens in high-level statecraft and diplomatic circles. And here's what he told me, that the arrest of Nicolas Maduro obviously is going to end all of those operations that we just talked about, but it's also going to expose something incredible. The election rigging apparatus that is run out of Venezuela. And this has been run by big-time Venezuela software companies that were started in Venezuela, Smartmatic, Dominion, and these companies have been used effectively to rig elections around the world, including American elections. And the person who would know the most about that is Nicolas Maduro. My source tells me that Nicolas Maduro straight up admitted that this is exactly how the elections have been rigged in the West using Venezuelan technology, and he has direct knowledge of it. Is that going to be part of some type of plea agreement? Is this going to be part of some type of sing like a canary situation with the feds? Is this Trump's major revenge for 2020? Along with, of course, understanding the network of left-wing NGOs and billionaires who fund these kind of things and world leaders, right? The left is sweating right now, and for good reason. It's all going to come out, and it's going to be biblical.
All right. Yeah, man. This is really, really interesting because many of us, people like me, have been saying for a while that how are these policies happening? We've been questioning, how is it that or how do we elect these people that are just completely out of touch? I mean, everybody knows this, right? Everybody sees certain politicians that are just completely out of touch. They're saying things that the average person on the street just does not agree with. Well, how is it possible that they get elected? Here it is. This is how. There's actually an underground kind of rigging system that it turns out was headquartered, or it has origins in Venezuela. And Venezuela controlled it. We're going to get into it in a minute. I've got another clip from this guy named Schuer, who's a ex-CIA analyst, and another guy named Gary Berntsen. And they're going to talk a little bit about this. But in fact, it's very long, and I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm going to play some of it to kind of give you some flavors of it. But it turns out that these guys in Venezuela, this company, there's a cartel involved, there's the governments involved, have been working with our CIA and other intelligence agencies to overthrow certain elections, like in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, and in 2020 in America when Joe Biden got elected. Remember, we talked about that. We were like, how did Joe Biden get 81 million votes? Well, the answer to that is he didn't. Okay, he didn't get that many votes. Obama, who was elected, just 4 years earlier than that, had the most votes ever cast for a candidate, and that was only like 68 million or something. So the answer is this has been rigged, and it's funny because Trump runs around and he says it's rigged, and the people in the polite press, say he's crazy, he doesn't know what he's talking about, and all this kind of stuff. It's just kind of interesting that this stuff really is rigged, and it does explain a lot of why we get these crazy politicians that say crazy things that nobody is advocating for. Nobody believes that there was some grassroots uprising of the need to have transgender surgeries on people that had gender dysphoria. I mean, this is insane. This was all paid for. These were politicians that were rigged into office, okay, using this voting system, and then NGOs that paid people off and kind of laid the foundational, money aspect to everything. And so this explains quite a bit, and I'm very excited to see where this goes. I don't know where it ultimately will go. But we're going to jump into this next clip. This is Michael Schuer on the left, and he's being interviewed by somebody about the 2020 election. But later on, another guy comes on named Gary Berntsen, and he kind of takes you through from the beginning to all these various stages. So let's listen to Schuer first, and then we'll come back to Berntsen after this.
Changed electronically in favor of Joe Biden, and if so, how was it done?
Well, I certainly do believe it, sir, because I saw it on TV on the crawls underneath television coverage of the election. At least two cases. One had about 12,000 votes that magically went from Trump to Biden, and another one about 20,000 votes. And both times, Trump's numbers decreased by exactly the number that Biden's increased. And so before any of this came about, I just had a strong inkling that something was afoot here. And the more they suggest that the intelligence service, our intelligence service, were involved in it, I tend to think that there probably was a great deal of vote marking by people when they found out how many votes they needed to surpass Trump in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan. I think clearly the Dominion company, if nothing else, it's foreign interference in an American election. It's a Canadian company. And it was storing its records in Germany and Spain for some reason.
Michael, who was behind this then?
Certainly appeared to be part of the Central Intelligence Agency, using for their political operations overseas. They use servers and store materials and do other things. And the fact that the ones in Germany were held or grabbed by U.S. forces because they were CIA servers. And in Europe, the CIA operates under the jurisdiction of the military. And so the military was responsible for seizing those with the help of the German authorities. And those servers are now in the hands of the FBI, which doesn't make me very comfortable, but at least they're in American hands.
In the last,
Yeah, it doesn't make me very comfortable either. And you've likely seen these video clips before where they show the Chiron in Pennsylvania, and in 1 minute there's some vote total, and then it just flip flops. Like 20,000 votes went swoop, and there's like a $40,000 differential within 1 minute. We've also all seen the graph that shows like where it kind of goes up and then it makes a sharp curve up, where, I don't know, 200,000 votes hit all at once, which it just doesn't happen that way. These votes come in batches, not in 200,000 vote batches, but in 3,000, 2,000, this kind of thing. And so we've seen that graph too, where, Trump was ahead. They closed the polls and boom, all of a sudden Biden was ahead. So there was a huge thing about it, right? January 6th was all about this, stop the steal. And there was a huge propaganda movement in the media to try to convince regular people that you were crazy if you thought the election was stolen and all this stuff. And so this really kind of picks the lock and explains quite a bit around Ukraine, for example. There's probably some we don't even know about, but in Ukraine, you had a referendum where the guy that wasn't leading in the polls won. Well, how did that happen? And, he just magically also seemed to be aligned with America and shared our policies with Russia, shared our ideas about policies with Russia. But, a lot of this doesn't make sense. We're going to not agree to sell gas to Germany and let them freeze. I don't know. Things just don't make sense, and it doesn't, mostly the world makes sense. But if you're, if you walk around, it's kind of like the way COVID was. If you walked around and you never talked to anybody during COVID, you didn't know anything was wrong. It was only because the media was telling you that something was wrong, It's kind of like that. And just like you and I don't go count the votes, us individually. We turn on the TV and the TV tells us who won. Well, how do they find out who won? Well, they consult the election, the counties that are counting all the votes. Well, where do the counties get the votes? Well, they get them from the machines. Well, who makes the machines? See, now we're getting to the crux of it. Who created the software, and who owns the software, the actual code, the source code, and what other machines is this source code showing up on? I'm glad you asked, because this guy has the history of all this, and he's another CIA. This guy's a CIA operative, former CIA operative named Gary Berntsen.
20 years, the Cartel del Sol has stolen $1 trillion from Venezuela's national oil company, PDVSA, and embezzled $500 billion from its national treasury. It not only has, but continues to produce and smuggle 25 to 40 metric tons of cocaine every month out of its country into the world. The Cartel del Sol is a $2 trillion transnational criminal organization and the most well-resourced criminal syndicate in history. Through bribery and investment of its funds, it controls 12 countries and world leaders. It has massive investments in the US and European financial markets and institutions. As we conducted investigations against the Cartel del Sol and presented them one after another to the US Department of Justice, we noticed and pursued leads from the cartel's money laundering operations to the world of non-governmental organizations and election companies. After witnessing election irregularities associated with the 2020 U.S. presidential election, we decided to direct time and resources to Cartel del Sol links to U.S. and global election fraud. After an exhaustive 3.5-year investigation, it is indisputable. Smartmatic election systems was created at the direction of now deceased Venezuelan dictator Hugo Chavez, and its source code, the basis of its operating system, developed jointly by Venezuela's Consejo Nacional Electoral and Smartmatic, was designed to allow election results to be altered without the knowledge of voters and the public. Additionally, the Venezuelan CNE holds ownership of Smartmatic's source code.
All right, so let's stop there and jump in here for a second. So let's start with Hugo Chavez. You know, out of a necessity to extend his political life in Venezuela, he contracted some guys to create this software to rig elections. And these guys were Venezuelans, okay? You have to remember when Hugo Chavez first started, when he first took over the country in Venezuela, he was elected. I mean, there were people that, socialists basically, that he said the gasoline should be free for the people and this should be free. And, he basically promised free stuff to everybody and he got elected. And then he started to deliver on all that stuff. And there, you can go online today and you'll find videos of people going, oh, we love Hugo Chavez. We're only paying 15 cents a gallon for gasoline. It's great. The problem is, you eventually run out of other people's money, right? This is the problem with socialism. But this all started because a few years into his election, he knew he wasn't going to be reelected. So in order to extend his political career, his longevity as president of Venezuela, he contracted this software development activity to happen. And then later on, you're going to hear the guy talk about the evolution of it all. But it started in this CNE, I forgot what it stands for, but he'll mention it again here in a second. And the CNE is the election owl or whatever. And these three guys worked for the CNE and created this source code and used it to control elections going forward. And this is just what happened. Now, we've since heard about these companies like Smartmatic and Dominion. Test that have come back and kind of extended this. It's kind of like hide the salami, right? They're every several years they change the ownership of the company. They move the source code. They sneak the source code into a new company, and then that company starts getting election contracts in some part of the world, and so on and so forth. But let's jump back in because I got a little tickle in my throat, and it's interesting. He talks about these guys and where they came from and how they were connected to MIT. And it's insane. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. He mentions the NGOs, and the NGOs are kind of what make all this legitimate, right? Because what NGOs can do, they get government money, they get taxpayer money from U.S. taxpayers, and they use that money to bribe people, to get control over certain aspects of the economy, to get DAs in that will not prosecute murders, but prosecute, I don't know, basically they're not prosecuting things we want them to prosecute, and then they're kind of over prosecuting on other things, like for example, like Trump. They They had like 38 counts of something against Trump in New York district, that Fannie Willis and Letitia James. I mean, people like that would not even have gotten elected if it weren't for NGOs and all this, election fraud and stuff like that. That's why guys like you and me, we're out here scratching our heads going, how does this imbecile get elected? She's an idiot. How does Maxine Waters continue to hold her office? We've all asked these questions. And the answer is, oh, yeah, well, that's because they have control of the election machines. So all this voting that you're doing, when people tell you, oh, you got to engage in the system, you got to get out there and vote. If you want to change the system, you need to work the process. It doesn't matter how hard you work the process because they're interfering with the process. And that's what this guy's talking about. All right, let's jump back into this.
Each time the Venezuelan CNE and Smartmatic update the source code, a copy of it is stored at the vault at the Venezuelan Central Bank. In 2005, a European Union electoral observation mission to Venezuela published a report stating the Venezuelan regime owns Smartmatic source code. The Venezuelan government signed that report as factual. Smartmatic's first election in Venezuela was the 2003 recall election of Hugo Chavez. The CNE director at the time, Jorge Rodriguez, at the direction of the Cuban Directorate General of Intelligence, DGI, hired 3 Venezuelan American computer engineers that were graduates of Simón Bolívar University, a Venezuelan university linked to the U.S. University MIT. They had already registered a software company in Delaware and opened an office for it in Boca Raton. The engineers, Antonio Mujica, Roger Peñate, and Alfredo Anzola, established Smartmatic at the direction of the Venezuelan regime, built the source code, and flew off to Italy to buy lottery machines from Olivetti to serve as election hardware. They succeeded in altering enough votes to ensure Hugo Chavez's victory in the recall election.
So just as a reminder, all this started because Hugo Chavez, I can't remember when he came to power. Maybe it was 1999. And you know how socialism is just this way. It's good for some period of time because there's a pile of money, right? And people are working. The economy's going, right? And then the socialist comes in and goes, oh, yeah, there's a pile of money. Let me take it and redirect it to this. And let me put my cronies in charge over here. And let me do this and let me do that. And it takes a few years for the productivity to go down, for the taxes to dry up, for bad things to start to happen. So these bad things are starting to happen. And Hugo Chavez, he sees this on the horizon. And so him, along with the Cuban government, put this plan into action. And they contract these 3 bright young engineers to create this source code. And then these guys run off to Italy and buy like lottery equipment machines for hardware to use to kind of cobble together essentially a voting platform. And all these companies were, they were chartered in Delaware, operated out of U.S. territories and things like that. It's just unbelievable that any of this is even possible. But the reason it's all possible is because corrupt politicians are on the take from the NGOs or whoever to get paid to not say anything. Okay, don't say anything. Here's $500,000. Where else are you going to get $500,000? You're a dumbass congressman or whatever. So it's just unbelievable. We're probably not going to play the whole story. I'm going to play a little bit more because he goes into the next stages. This all started because Hugo Chavez wanted to prolong his political career, but then it worked so well that he's got like this, Dr. Evil idea. Hey, let me. There's elections happening all over the world. I can sell this to other countries that want to overthrow certain political leaders, or they don't want certain people in power, and I'll just sell to the highest bidder. And this is kind of the stuff he was doing.
Secure in power, President Chavez decided to weaponize this capability beyond Venezuela's border. Smartmatic would enter into the U.S. election market in Cook County, Illinois, and the state of New Jersey for Democratic Party primary races in 2006. In 2005, Smartmatic orchestrated the purchase of Sequoia Voting Systems, Inc., a U.S. company. Sequoia was a company that had conducted elections in the U.S. for over 100 years and had a 22% market share of the U.S. electoral market. Approximately 18 months later, the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, CFIUS, began investigating the ownership of Smartmatic because of Smartmatic's Venezuelan connection. Smartmatic immediately put its source code in the machines, in the Sequoia machines. Smartmatic tried to conceal its Venezuelan connection by hiring a former U.S. naval officer, Jack Blaine, to set up a holding company, SVS Holding, to place its ownership of Sequoia in stock. In December 2006, Smartmatic entered into an agreement with CFIUS to sell Sequoia in 6 months. Antonio Mujica, one of the three original founders, then found a little-known election company in Toronto, Canada, Dominion Election Systems, that had only managed one small local election in Toronto. He arranged for Dominion to purchase Sequoia. Dominion, owned by John Polis, with that purchase of Sequoia, would inherit the licensing agreement for Smartmatic's source code, the source code owned by the Venezuelan regime, i.e. the Cartel del Sol.
Okay. I mean, this is insane, right? This Sequoia ended up being kind of an intermediary, right? Because you had Smartmatic purchase Sequoia, and Sequoia already had 22% of the voting market. And when you dig into this a little deeper, and feel free to do so, Sequoia was mostly in these swing states. So now you've got this election technology that was created by Venezuela, the Cuban government, and the cartel. The cartel comes in later, I guess. They weren't involved in the development, but they were certainly involved in the exportation, the exporting of this technology to other governments and other elections around the world to create revenue for the regime, this repression regime in Venezuela. But it's unbelievable. And of course, the NGOs were there to pay people to shut up or look away or whatever. But notice how it started in Cook County. Whose political career started in Cook County? Barack Hussein Obama. And I don't know, man. This could end up. I don't know how deep they're going to dig into this. Hopefully, they dig into it very deeply. And it sounds like Trump is already on it. But this could implicate a whole bunch of people. It's kind of like Epstein. I mean, now you got two things that really pick the lock, that really explain why we live in an upside down world. Okay. On one hand, you've got Epstein and his trafficking and blackmail ring that hopefully one day we'll get to the bottom of, that seems to be blackmailing politicians, powerful corporations, people that lead powerful corporations. And then you've got on the other side, on the institutional side, you've got, that's not institutional, right? That's clearly illegal activity. But then on the institutional side, you've got voting fraud that's been institutionalized inside governments, legitimized inside governments, local governments, state governments, federal government. And Dominion seems to be at the heart of this. Now, I remember talking a long time ago now, back when Tucker Carlson got fired from Fox, the Dominion lawsuit and Tucker Carlson's firing were right on top of each other. I mean, they basically happened at the same time. And I was theorizing, and to be clear, this was only a theory. It's still only a theory, that there was some sort of quid pro quo with Fox News on this. And I don't have any evidence for this, but it seemed like that Fox News pled guilty to reporting that Dominion defrauded the electoral process. And if they pled guilty to that, maybe this quid pro quo, you guys, okay, we'll make you whole through the NGOs or whatever, but you got to get rid of Tucker Carlson. And I think they thought they were just going to get rid of Tucker Carlson for good. Like he was just going to disappear and have to go, I don't know, be a salesman somewhere or something. I mean, just find another career. Of course, Tucker Carlson now, in hindsight, is bigger than ever. And maybe that wasn't such a smart thing to do. But I don't have any evidence for that. But it just, in the realm of speculation, it seemed plausible because the timing of all that was very strange. And it was also strange given the evidence that Sidney Powell and some of these people had. It seemed strange that Fox News was pleading guilty to that and was willing to pay $700 million. I just thought that was all really bizarre. You know, if somebody tells you got to pay $700 million, but then over here they're saying, hey, look, just go ahead and pay the $700 million. We'll get it back to you. We'll get your $700 million back. What's the big deal of saying, yeah, we screwed up. We'll pay the $700 million. Wink, nod, nod. And then they get their $700 million back later. That was kind of my theory. And we'll get rid of Tucker Carlson in the middle of all this because he's part of it. He's part of the one talking about Dominion is doing some improper shit. But now you've got, and we've come full circle. We found out that all this voting technology started in Venezuela. The CIA guys telling you all about it here. And now you got Trump coming in and nabbing the former president of Venezuela, the illegally placed president of Venezuela, and exposing all this. Now, the question really is, how far does this go and how much are we going to get to see? And the answer to that question, I have no idea. What I want to do, though, is I want to fast forward a little bit to the end. Go listen to this whole report from this guy because it's really good. But I want to go to the end because this guy kind of sums some stuff up here that I thought was really interesting. So I want to play that. All right, here we go.
In the People's Republic of China.
They learned about this in around 2007, these capabilities. Barack Obama and John Brennan started using it in July of 2009. They set up an Arlington, Virginia NGO called SEPS. George Soros staffed it. The CIA funded it through USAID, $5.9 billion. And they spread this junk technology from the Philippines to Netherlands and everywhere. You know how in the Netherlands, the government's like shutting down farming and the people are all against it, but they keep on electing these lefties. They're not really getting elected. They're getting elected on Smartmatic equipment. It's an overthrow. It's genius.
Yeah. So this is what I mean by this kind of narrative that this guy's telling. It kind of picks the lock. It explains why some of this crazy shit is happening. Because nobody like me or you are voting for these people to shut down farms in the Netherlands. I mean, look, I work with people from the Netherlands, and they don't have any interest in shutting down farms that have been in people's families for hundreds of years. This is something that the globalists are trying to carry out. They're saying that farming is killing the planet. We could argue about whether or not that's the case, which I don't believe it is, but farming also feeds human beings. You know, you just can't snap your fingers and get rid of farming. That's insane, right? I mean, people saying that are insane. And the people that are doing it, you know, with the force of government are the most insane. And so the question is, how are they getting elected? To this guy's point, they're not. They're being, they're like Manchurian candidates, technologically speaking. All right. The last clip I have is just for a little icing on the cake. This is Joe Biden himself telling us about how he created all this. Him and Barack Obama created all this. Now, this could be a Freudian slip, but I just think it's classic that they got Joe Biden on camera saying this. So let somebody play it for you.
We have put together, and you guys did it for our administration, the President Obama's administration before this. We have put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics.
Wow. That's crazy, isn't it? And that's crazy that he said that. But sometimes, you know, sometimes they do slip, especially as confused as Biden was. You know, he probably was trying to say that in a way that he was probably trying to talk about coalitions or something like that. I mean, who knows what the hell the guy was trying to talk about. But the fact that he used the term voter fraud, that we put together the most extensive, most inclusive, who gives a shit about that? If you're putting something together to defraud voters and you're bragging, you're patting yourself on the back because it's inclusive, I mean, that's just stupid. But this is what I'm talking about. These types of stories really bring a lot of explanation into why the world is so upside down. Why do politicians seem to be doing things that are not in the interest of their constituents. We talk about on this show all the time that, supposedly we have a government of, for, and by the people. And the idea is you vote for your representatives and your representatives represent you. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening, right? And so things like Epstein, things like this Dominion voting systems or Smartmatic or this Venezuelan smart source code for voting manipulation, these kinds of ideas really pick the lock for what the hell's going on. And to the extent that people keep digging into this and the president and his staff keep pushing on these, now they kind of dropped the ball on the whole Epstein thing. And I think it's still possible that Trump pays a really big price for this in the midterms, that we potentially lose the House to Democrats. But that's not Candace Owens' fault, and that's not some of these other people's fault. That's Trump's fault for taking his eye off the ball. And I think there were a lot of people that really understood the Epstein story as part of the problem, part of what explains why their lives don't work. Now, on this show, we've given you guys the foundational problem, right? So you might look at Epstein or even this voting stuff, Smartmatic stuff, and you might see, okay, that's the problem with the political process. But underneath that is the money situation, okay? The reason NGOs have so much money is because it doesn't cost anything for the government to create the money. They don't have to tax it from us, so they don't have to risk rebellion or being kicked out of office. If they had to tax it from us to give it to the NGOs, just trust me, the NGOs would not be getting the money. The reason the NGOs get the money is because it's easy for the government to give them the money because it doesn't have to come ask us for it. It can just borrow it into existence. And people go, and look, I mean, average voter, they're not connecting the dots anyway. I mean, yeah, they see the country spending a bunch of money and borrowing a bunch of money, but they're not going, oh, NGOs wouldn't exist if we couldn't borrow. They don't make that connection. But that connection is absolutely there because for NGOs to have money in an honest money society, that money would have to be taxed away from you and me. And the problem is the government historically has only ever been able to tax, roughly 20% from the population. So this just wouldn't be possible. If you take the money we borrow plus the money we tax, it's like 35%. So there's an extra 15% in there the government's getting or so that they just wouldn't be able to get under normal circumstances. And all of a sudden, all these programs would be run a lot more carefully. There would actually be a budget. I don't know if you guys know this, but we haven't had a budget in like 9 years or something. 15 years? I don't know. I think since like 2012, we haven't had a budget. We've just been doing these omnibus bills. And so that all comes from this largesse around fiat money. That's where that all comes from. All right, with that, I want to wrap up the show. Thank you guys for listening. Thanks for coming in and watching. If you are listening, listen carefully. If you are listening on your podcatcher, go to YouTube and look up the show and watch it again on YouTube. I'm trying to get some people to watch on YouTube so that the web crawlers can kind of crawl around the internet and look for other listeners that would be interested in this freedom-oriented, liberty-oriented discussion on topics that we see in the news every day. And so if you would, please take the time to do that. And, comment on the show, share the show, all those other great things. All right, everybody, thanks for coming in. Thanks for listening. Until next time, peace, and we'll see you later. Take care.